Okay, well, let's talk about the objective conception of risk now. So this is the view that risk is out there and it's something measurable, and it's something, importantly, that we can mathematize. And our ability to turn risk into a mathematical quantity is what makes us think that we can make pretty reliable predictions when it comes to these risk judgments that we need to make, or that we seem to need to make in these various legal contexts. So the objective conception of risk defines risk in terms of these quantifiable harms and losses. For example, bodily harm or property damage. These are things that we can record and keep an account of so that we can get a sense of how frequently they occur. Risks like these are often boiled down into costs, right? So you think about the risk of my house being struck by lightning, or the risk of falling down the stairs at my house. And for these sorts of things, we buy insurance. So risk is the bread and butter of insurance companies. They have risk analysts who gather all this data and make predictions about the likelihood that people will make a claim on their insurance, and they base the premiums that they charge people in a way that takes into account all of those risks, but so that the firm or the company still makes money by selling insurance policies. Obviously, they're companies designed to make money, so they want to set their prices so that they're affordable enough that people will buy them, but so they're expensive enough so that the company still makes money. So the objective conception of risk requires that you know at least one of two things. So there are multiple different objective conceptions of risk. So one thing that you need to know is the objective probability of the outcome that you're interested in. You also want to know the objective value of an outcome. So ideally, you can get an objective account of how frequently some event occurs in a population. And then also you can put an objective value on it. You can say, if someone gets cardiovascular disease, how much does it cost to take care of them, for them to get all the relevant sorts of treatments? And that will give you a kind of objective value in the sense of pounds and pence, like how much is it going to cost to take care of this person? So these are two things that you need to know for most objective conceptions of risk. So on the objective approach to risk, risk is really construed as an essentially probabilistic matter. Risk is the probability of an unwanted outcome or risk event, which may or may not occur. So this is the dominant conception of risk. Again, this is the way people basically will say, if you're not thinking about risk as a kind of probability, then you're not thinking about risk at all. Risk is intrinsically probabilistic. The reason for this is that it allows people to represent risk mathematically. And once you represent it mathematically, you can put it into all kinds of different calculations and make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. Every risk event on this approach bears a definite numerical value from 0 to 1. So if there's a 0% occurrence of the relevant event in the target population, then there's a risk of 0. And if it occurs in every single instance, 100% of the time, then it gets a numerical value of 1. And then there's every single number in between 0 and 1. So at 0, the risk event will not occur. At a probability of 1, the risk event will definitely occur. And at a probability of 0.5, the event is as likely to occur as not to occur. So, and as a corollary of this, and again, this is why this approach to risk is considered so powerful. If risk is essentially a probabilistic matter, that means that the laws of probability theory provides the correct normative standards for assessing risk. So if you want to think rationally about risk, you have to think about it in terms of probability theory. And this, again, this is very important because this is what's going to give rise to a number of the paradoxes in legal contexts, because academic critics who have this probabilistic conception of risk are going to look at what's going on in legal practice, and they're going to say, hey, you guys are being irrational. You're not using probability theory to sort of assess risk in the correct way. And maybe legal theorists and judges and the people working in the law have reasons for this. Maybe there are reasons to have a non-probabilistic approach, but that's something that we're going to discuss as we move on. So just to give you a little more background about probability theory, there's really two main families. One approach, and this is maybe the dominant approach in a number of disciplines, is to treat risk as a subjective affair, right? This is also referred to as the Bayesian model of risk, named after Bayes, who came up with Bayes' law. If you've studied statistics, you've probably studied it. But here, Risk is defined as the agent's coherent degree of belief or their credence that the event will occur. So this is truly subjective. It's just about what the agent believes the probability of the event occurring is. And so this isn't very attractive to many people in practical contexts like the law, because they think, well, who cares what some person happens to believe about the probability? We want to know what the objective probability is. And we'll talk about why some people think that doesn't really matter. I mean, just to put it simply, people who work on Bayesian approaches to statistics say, well, it doesn't matter what probability you start with, because if you update your beliefs, if you update your priors when new evidence comes in, according to Bayes' rule, then you will eventually converge on the correct belief about what the probability of some event is. But the problem is often you don't have time. You don't have the infinite time to sort of update your beliefs. You have to make a judgment right now. And if you don't have an objective sense of how likely something is right now, then it's just your opinion. And it doesn't seem to carry any kind of force, any normative force. So this offers determinate practical answers, right? Because what's the probability that some event is going to occur? Well, it's just what you believe it is, but it doesn't really seem to furnish objective answers. So it hasn't been very influential in the law, at least not in the areas that we're going to be looking at. And on the other hand, the dominant approach to risk is referred to as objective. And this is where risk is construed as something that's independent of anyone's belief. Risk is just a matter of what occurs in the actual world, and regardless of what we happen to believe about it. And so it's properly objective in the sense that it's true independent of anyone's perspective. So the dominant objective approach is what's called the relative frequency approach, also referred to as frequentism. And I've already kind of talked about it, right? So the basic approach to determining risk is to designate a reference class that includes the target risk event. So find the class of people or events that you're interested in, and then you can study the rate at which the target risk event occurs in that reference class. So designate a reference class that you're interested in, determine what proportion of the events or individuals in that reference class has the relevant property. For example, say 1 out of every 100 members of a community-based population will commit a violent act in the next year. So in that case, your reference class is a community-based population, and the proportion with the relevant property is 1 out of 100. So reference class is that population, and the rate of occurrence or the frequency or the proportion with the property, those are all terms that mean the same thing, is 1 out of 100. So that means you have a 1 in 100th or a 0.01 risk of violence in that population. And that number is also referred to as the base rate. It's the base rate of violence in that community-based population. It describes the percentage of the population that demonstrates some characteristic. So that's it. It's very simple, actually. The sort of dominant objective approach to thinking about risk is to think about it, relative frequencies. How often does the target risk event occur in some specific reference class? So risk is the frequency of some risk event in a given reference class. So that's the basic dominant objective approach to risk. Risk is an objective description of some population. And it doesn't matter what you believe about the population. What matters is the facts about that population. So you have to have access to those facts in order to think in this kind of objective way about risk. So that's one dominant objective model of risk. And it only requires that you know the probability of the event. So the risk of the event is the probability of that event in a given reference class. Now, another profoundly influential model that does show up in the law is this idea of expectation value. So on this approach, risk is not just the probability of the event, but it also includes consideration about the event's utility or its disutility. So this approach has its origins in decision theory, and decision theory is a kind of branch of mathematics that tries to think about how we can make rational decisions about probable outcomes. Another way to think about it is, how can you gamble responsibly, or how can you gamble effectively? And expected value, or risk as expectation value, is conceived in these mathematical terms. So the expectation value of X, where X is some outcome, is the probability of that outcome multiplied by its utility, or its disutility. This gives you an objective measure, arguably, of what will happen if that event occurs. Okay, so I'm going to try to give you a sketch of the basic idea here with a classic example of the coin toss. So let's say I offer you a bet. I say, I'm going to flip this coin, and if you get it right, I'll pay you 50 pounds. And if you get it wrong, you pay me 40 pounds. So there's two possible actions. You can refuse to take the bet, or you can take the bet. And in both of those cases, we know the objective probabilities and we know the values or the utility. So the expected value of not taking the bet is going to be a multiple of how likely you are to get money and how much money you will get. And in this case, the value is 1 times 0 because there's a 100% chance that you're not getting any money from me if you refuse to take the bet. 1 times 0 is equal to 0. So that's the expected value of not taking the bet. Things are a little bit more complicated when we're calculating the expected value of taking the bet. Here, you have a 0.5 chance or a 50% chance of winning 50 pounds, and you have a 0.5 chance of losing 40 pounds. So to find the risk that you're facing here, right, or the expected value of this decision, you calculate those two multiples and add them together. And in this case, that means 25 minus 20. So the expected value of taking the bet is positive. It's 5 pounds. And importantly, it's higher than the expected value of not taking the bet. And so the rational person in this case should take the bet because it has a positive expected value. Again, this is just a very simple illustration of the basic idea. And this is essentially, though, how companies that use risk to analyze their decisions think about those decisions. So they think long term, what's the expected value of making this decision going to be? Are we going to make more profit or less? And if the answer is more, they take that course of action. So you should take the bet if you're rational, according to decision theory. Okay, so an important thing to note here is that there are no hidden costs in this example, and it's about long-term thinking. The idea is that in the long run, you'll tend to maximize the expected value of your decisions, right? So yeah, sure, you might lose 40 pounds on this particular bet, but if you're the kind of person who always, right, in all circumstances, takes this kind of bet, then in the long run, you're going to end up making more than you lose. That's the idea. So probabilistic approaches are beloved for their long-term predictive power. If you have really good information, really good probabilistic information about the relative frequencies of different things happening in a reference class, then in the long run, you can make a lot of decisions and make a lot of money. So insurance companies know that if you know what percentage of 55-year-old men with metabolic syndrome have negative health outcomes, if you know the objective probabilities, and you know how much their care will cost, right? You have an objective measure of that cost in pounds, then you can set policy prices such that you profit off 55-year-old men with metabolic syndrome, right? So this is essentially what actuaries or risk analysts who work for insurance firms are doing all their time. They're trying to set policy prices so that the company makes money. And why am I talking about this stuff with insurance firms and so on? Because this is part of the reason why people think that this approach to risk is the only rational approach, because it's a good way for making decisions on a sort of large scale level. So to sum up this second objective conception of risk is construed as the statistical expectation value of an unwanted event which may or may not occur. It's important to note here, right? So when we were doing the expected value of taking the bet, the unwanted event is the one where you lose money. One way of thinking about this is that the risk properly construed is that one. But on the other hand, you could say that the whole thing is the proper way to define risk. And some risks are positive. And that kind of goes against our intuitive thinking about risk, I think. Intuitively, we tend to think that risk is a bad thing. But there's this whole phenomenon of risk-taking where we're actually taking risks to bring about some positive outcome for ourselves. So we should keep that in mind too, because I think it's important in having a fuller conception of risk. But anyways, on this approach, risk is construed as the objective probability of a harm multiplied by the measure of its severity. And today, this is seen by many people as the only correct usage of the term risk. if you're not talking about risk this way, some people will say, well, you're not really talking about risk, are you? So that's the objective conception of risk. Risk is, on one objective conception, construed just as the probability or objective frequency of some unwanted event, or it's construed as the expectation value of a negative event. So the objective probability multiplied by some measure of its negativity. And according to many people who work in this area, if you're not talking about one of these, you're not talking about risk. Also, again, an important corollary to this is that if you're not using the rules of probability theory to make risk decisions, then you're not making rational risk decisions. And that's going to be really important when we talk about the problems that emerge in the law with respect to risk. So, is this objective conception of risk actually enshrined in the law? Well, if you think back to all those legal documents that I showed you earlier, it seems like maybe it is, right? So the document from the UN General Assembly talks about the serious likelihood of immediate or imminent harm. Edwards versus UK talks about whether authorities knew or ought to have known of a real and immediate risk. The Mental Capacity Act talks about the likelihood and seriousness of harm. The Mental Health Act amendment talks about likelihood and seriousness of harm. The Deprivation of Liberties form that we looked at talks about severity and likelihood. And the Irish Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act of 2015 talks about likelihood and seriousness of such harm. So intuitively, at least, they really do seem to be working with this idea of expectation value in these legal documents. And we're going to talk about whether or not that's true, or whether that might be misleading in some respect. So anyways, it looks like they're talking about risk being an objective probability of a harm multiplied by a measure of its severity. So right now, I'd encourage you to take a break and to think about all the new concepts that you've just been acquainted with. Maybe rewatch this part of the lecture if it's something that you're not familiar with, because if you've never encountered these ideas before, there might be a lot of questions that you have that you might want to ask, and I'd welcome you to bring those to our first meeting. Thank you.